The phone call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Ethan Mercer made it from the parking lot of Iron Line Freight's Eastern Distribution Hub, standing beside his truck in the November cold, with his termination paperwork folded in his jacket pocket and his breath visible in the air in front of him. He had been calm when Victor Hale read the violations to him in the conference room. He had been calm when Clara Bennett signed the form without quite meeting his eyes. He had been calm when the security escort walked him to his locker and waited while he collected the 3 personal items he kept there: a photograph of his daughter Lily, a folding multi-tool his father had given him, and a worn copy of OSHA's General Industry Standards that he had been reading for 9 years and had never needed to use quite the way he suspected he was about to need it now. He made the call and the phone rang once, and a woman named Agnes picked up, and he told her what had happened, and she said, quietly and without drama, "Understood, I'll file the activation within the hour." He said thank you. He hung up. He stood in the parking lot for a moment. The November wind moved across the lot and rattled the chain-link fence along the perimeter, and somewhere inside the building behind him, 43 dock workers were finishing the morning shift without knowing what had just changed about the company they worked for. He got in his truck and drove to Lily's school to eat lunch with her, because he had the afternoon free for the first time in several months, and she had been asking him to come on a Wednesday for as long as he could remember, and it seemed like a reasonable use of the day. Ethan Mercer was 38 years old and had worked at Iron Line Freight for 7 years. First as a dock hand and then, for the past 4 years, as a dock supervisor, the kind of supervisor who knew every name on every shift, who covered hours when people called out, who kept the incident log with a precision that the safety auditors consistently praised and that Victor Hale had consistently found inconvenient. He was not a large man, not a loud man, not someone who announced himself in any room he entered. He had a daughter named Lily who was 9 and brought him drawings of trucks and forklifts that she left in his work bag, and he had been raising her alone since his wife Diane died 3 years ago in the way that deaths come that are simply the worst thing that has happened to a person and continue being that for a long time after. Nobody at Iron Line Freight knew anything about the trust. The Northbridge Logistics Family Trust had been established 22 years earlier by Ethan's grandfather, a man named Roosevelt Mercer, who had started a trucking company with a single leased vehicle in 1971 and had, over 30 years, built it into a regional freight operation that served 4 states and employed over 600 people before the holding company acquisition that eventually folded it into what became Northbridge Logistics, the parent company of Iron Line Freight. Roosevelt had structured the sale carefully, retaining a convertible equity position that had been passed on his death 11 years ago to his son and then on his son's death 3 years later. The same year Diane died, a year Ethan did not look back on voluntarily. To Ethan. The trust held a controlling stake in Northbridge Logistics that could be activated under specific conditions to assume direct voting control of the board. The activation clause had never been used. Roosevelt had called it a last resort, and Ethan had always understood exactly what he meant. Ethan had not disclosed the trust to anyone at Iron Line Freight, not because it was required to be disclosed. It wasn't under his employment agreement so long as he performed his role without using the position to benefit himself. He had kept it private because he had learned from his grandfather and from his own years of watching people that the surest way to stop understanding how something really worked was to stop being the kind of person it revealed itself to honestly. As a dock supervisor making $42,000 a year, he understood Iron Line Freight in a way that no executive in the Northbridge building had understood it in at least a decade. Victor Hale had been regional director of operations for 14 months. He was 46 years old, educated at 2 schools whose names he introduced into conversations he was in no way conducting, and he moved through the logistics industry with the particular confidence of a man who had mistaken the fear of his subordinates for the respect of his peers. He had come to Iron Line Freight's Eastern Hub with a mandate from the executive committee to cut operating costs by 12% before the fiscal year closed, and he had interpreted this mandate, as people of a certain kind reliably do, as permission to be whatever he needed to be. The freight fraud had started before Victor arrived, but it had found in Victor exactly the right kind of oversight. A vendor called Halcyon Supply, registered in the name of a company incorporated by Victor's brother-in-law 6 weeks before Victor joined Northbridge, had been receiving contracts for equipment maintenance services since month 2 of Victor's tenure. The contracts were awarded without competitive bidding under an emergency procurement exception that Victor had approved himself. Halcyon Supply existed on paper, had a licensed contractor number, and had never performed a single hour of actual maintenance on a single piece of equipment at any iron line facility. The invoices totaled $1.3 million in 14 months. The dock equipment had been maintained through that same period by Iron Line's own internal crew, whose hours were logged separately and whose work Ethan had been documenting in the safety record with his usual precision, a precision that created, for anyone who looked at both sets of records at the same time, an obvious and damning contradiction. Victor had been watching Ethan's documentation for 3 months before he decided what to do about it. The fabricated violations were not difficult to construct for someone with access to the incident management system and the willingness to use it without restraint. A forklift near Miss Ethan had allegedly failed to report. A safety checklist bearing his signature on a date he had been on approved leave. 2 witness statements from dock workers whose names appeared on the shift log, but who, when the records were later examined carefully, had not been scheduled that week. Victor presented the violations to Clara Bennett on a Monday morning and told her the termination needed to happen before the end of the week. Clara was 39 years old and had been regional VP for operations for 2 years, promoted from within and aware, on some level that she had not yet articulated fully to herself, that Victor did not consider her a peer. She reviewed the file. She noticed the leave overlap on the second checklist. She asked Victor about it and received an answer that explained it without satisfying her. The way answers that are constructed to explain without satisfying always leave a particular residue. She signed the form. She would spend 3 days afterward unable to fully account for why, and on the 4th day she would understand that the reason was simpler than she wanted it to be. She had been afraid of Victor Hale in a way she had not admitted to herself, and that fear had used her hands without her permission. Ethan was called to the conference room on Wednesday morning. Victor read the violations. Clara sat beside him with the form in front of her and did not raise the leave overlap again. Ethan listened to each charge without interrupting, and when Victor finished, he said, "Those records are incorrect. I'd like to request a copy of the documentation so I can review it." Victor said, "That's a matter for HR during the appeals process. Your access has been suspended effective immediately." Ethan said, "All right." He stood up. He shook Clara's hand, which seemed to surprise her. He did not shake Victor's. "Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's go." The activation notice reached Northbridge Logistics Corporate Counsel at 9:47 that morning. By 10:15, the board chair, a woman named Harriet Webb, who had been with Northbridge since the acquisition of Roosevelt Mercer's company and who had known Ethan since he was 17 years old, had read the notice, read it a second time, and picked up the phone to call the corporate attorney, whose response confirmed everything she had read and added several things she had not yet had time to consider. By 11 o'clock, an emergency board meeting had been scheduled for the following Monday. By noon, the board's outside counsel had begun a formal review of the Halcyon Supply contracts, triggered automatically by the activation clause's requirement of an independent audit whenever a majority holder exercised board control rights. Victor Hale spent Wednesday afternoon in his office preparing a presentation on Q4 cost reduction targets. He did not know that the audit had begun. He did not know that the board had been notified. He did not know that a woman named Mara Ellis, who had been Iron Line Freight's HR coordinator for 6 years and who had processed Ethan's termination paperwork that morning with a growing, inarticulate unease, had spent her lunch break making a quiet request of the company's document management system for the metadata associated with the incident reports in Ethan's file. Mara was 34 years old and had a background in information systems that she had never particularly advertised at Iron Line, because she had found that people who knew she could trace document histories tended to behave differently around her, and she preferred them behaving normally. She pulled the metadata at 12:45 and ate her lunch at her desk and read what the data told her, which was this. 3 of the 4 incident reports in Ethan's file had been created and modified within the same 14-hour window, 7 weeks ago, from a single workstation registered to Victor Hale's administrative login. The dates on the reports, the dates they claimed to describe, were weeks in the past. She printed the metadata report. She put it in her desk drawer. She sat with it for 24 hours exactly before she brought it to Clara Bennett. Clara read it standing at Mara's desk on Thursday afternoon. She stood still for a long time after she finished. She said, "How long have you known this?" Mara said, "Since yesterday lunch." Clara said, "Why did you wait?" Mara said, "I wanted to be completely sure before I said anything to anyone, because the person who created those records is a regional director, and I'm an HR coordinator, and I needed to understand exactly what I was holding before I decided who to hold it for." Clara looked at the metadata report one more time. She said, "You should have brought this to me yesterday." Mara said, "I know. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure you'd be safe to bring it to." The sentence landed in the room and neither of them said anything about it for a moment because it was true and they both understood that it was true and there was nothing to add to it. Clara brought the metadata report to the board's outside counsel on Friday morning. The outside counsel added it to the audit file and thanked her without telling her anything about what else the audit had already found, which was standard practice and which left Clara walking back to her car in the Northbridge parking garage with the information that she had done the right thing and the complete absence of information about whether it would matter. She drove home and made dinner and put herself to bed early and lay awake for a long time thinking about the leave overlap she had noticed and not pursued, and what it said about her and whether it was the kind of thing that could be corrected. The emergency board meeting was held on Monday morning at the Northbridge Logistics corporate office, a building Victor had visited 12 times since joining the company and had always found appropriately deferential to the significance of his role. He had been informed of the meeting on Friday afternoon, told only that it was a routine governance matter requiring regional leadership attendance, and he had spent the weekend preparing nothing because he could not imagine what it might require him to prepare for. He walked into the boardroom at 8:50 and found 8 board members already seated, the company's outside counsel at the side table with 4 bankers' boxes of documents, Clara Bennett near the wall with the expression of a person who has been awake for several nights consecutively, and Mara Ellis sitting 2 seats down from her, a copy of the metadata report in front of her on the table. Victor looked at the documents. He looked at Mara. He looked at Clara and formed, in the fraction of a second before the door opened again, a rapid assessment of how to make what he was seeing Clara's fault. The door opened and Ethan Mercer walked in. Victor did not recognize him for a moment. He was wearing a different jacket from the one he'd worn on Wednesday, a charcoal blazer that Victor had no framework for because the only version of Ethan Mercer he had ever constructed was a dock supervisor in a work shirt, and the mind builds its certainties from the material it has decided to pay attention to. Then Victor recognized him, and the room became very quiet. Harriet Webb said, "I believe most of you know Ethan Mercer from Iron Line Freight's Eastern Hub. For those who may not have the full context, Ethan holds a majority beneficial interest in Northbridge Logistics through a family trust established by his grandfather, Roosevelt Mercer, whose company formed the foundation of what became this organization. That interest was activated last Wednesday morning, which is why we are all in this room today." Victor said, "That's not..." He stopped. He started again. "He wasn't disclosed as a..." Ethan said quietly, "I wasn't required to disclose it under my employment agreement so long as I performed my role without conflict. I loaded trucks for 2 years and supervised a dock crew for 4. I don't believe there was a conflict." Victor looked at Clara. He said, "She signed the termination. She was the one who..." Clara said, "I signed a document that contained forged incident reports and backdated safety violations created from your workstation. The metadata is in front of you if you'd like to review it." Victor looked at the metadata report. He looked at the Halcyon Supply audit summary that the outside counsel had set in front of him while his attention was elsewhere. He looked at the room, the board members who were not meeting his eyes, the counsel whose face carried the specific neutrality of someone who has already decided how a proceeding will end and is waiting patiently for it to arrive there. And he appeared to arrive in that moment at the understanding that there was no version of the next several minutes that ended in his favor. He said nothing further. He was advised by the outside counsel of the board's determination to suspend his executive authority pending the completion of the audit and a separate review by outside investigators, and the referral of the Halcyon supply contracts to law enforcement for criminal fraud review. He was escorted from the building by the same building security he had himself once instructed on the protocols for removing unauthorized visitors from the premises. Ethan sat at the head of the table for the first time and looked at the room that had been his grandfather's in a way it had never quite been his until now. Harriet Webb said, "The board will want to discuss your intentions for the business going forward. When you're ready." Ethan said, "I want the dock workers Victor targeted with inflated write-ups and reduced hours during the past several months, reviewed and made whole. That's the first item. The second is a complete overhaul of the safety documentation system, a third-party audit standard that doesn't depend on any single manager's access for integrity. The third is a reporting structure where any employee at any level can submit safety or fraud concerns directly to the board without going through their regional chain of command." He looked down at his hands for a moment. "I had all three of these concerns before last Wednesday. I should have done something about them before it took what it took." Harriet said, "You could have used the trust at any time." Ethan said, "My grandfather used to say that the trust was for the last resort because you should only reach for it when you've run out of the slower ways to do things right. I thought I had more time." He had not, as it turned out, been wrong, only wrong about how close the clock was to running out and on whose behalf it was running. Clara Bennett was appointed Interim Regional Director of Operations 2 weeks later, with a mandate that Ethan wrote himself, and that began with a single sentence. "This role is accountable to the people it serves." Mara Ellis was named HR Director for the Eastern Division, a promotion that was formally recommended by Clara and approved by the board in the same session. The dock workers, 6 of them across 3 shifts, who had received inflated disciplinary write-ups during the previous 8 months were reviewed independently, the write-ups vacated, and the reduced hours made whole with back pay. The Halcyon Supply criminal referral produced results within the month. Victor's brother-in-law cooperated with investigators early. Victor did not, and was indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud and 2 of obstruction.